So we're here for the first episode of That's Mental, and we're with former Tornado GR4 Nav, Mark Phats Taylor. So Mark, can you tell us a bit about your background in the RAF?
Yeah, sure, Mike. So I joined the RAF back in 1999. I actually joined into the pilot branch to start with, and I was streamed fast jet before not making the grade in the front cockpit and then re-branching into the nav or WISO branch as it was described at the time. So I went to be a weapons systems officer, and fortunately for me, I was able through that branch to get back to the job I was wanted to do, which was to be a mud mover. And I got to the Tornado front line in a GR4 cockpit, serving first of all on 9 Squadron. At the end of my first tour, I went off and did a ground job. I went to work with 3 Commander Brigade as the air advisor to the brigade commander out of Stonehouse Barracks in Plymouth. As part of that, saw a tour on the ground in Afghanistan before coming back to flying. I did a couple more tours on, firstly, 12 Squadron Lossiemouth with the Tornado again, and then to 31 Squadron, where I was a flight commander and the XO on the Gold Stars at Marham. And then I finished my RAF career in a staff job, but I was fortunate enough still to be in a flying suit, in that I was the chief of staff and lead of the trials program for fast jet test and evaluation on 41 Squadron at RAF Coningsby. So I was there in a non-flying role, but very close to the Typhoon program. Saw some new capabilities brought onto that platform, which actually takes me to where I am today. I left the service in 2019, and I now work for MBDA on air-to-air missiles. So there's no irony lost on me in the fact that I was a mud mover, I was a ground attack guy, and my career now is in sales and business development for MBDA, working on their air-to-air products, their air dominance products, ASRAM and Meteor.
Brilliant stuff. I mean, what a career. But obviously we're here to talk about mental health. And when did your issues, or when did you become aware of, mental health, and how did it affect you in your RAF career?
Yeah, it's a really good question to say, when did I become aware of mental health? Because I know, looking back now, having been through a period of depressive illness, having recovered from that, but I know now, looking back, if I look back probably 10 years from now, and if you'd asked me, do I need to think about mental health? Do I need to be concerned about mental health? I would have probably said no, because at that point, I know now, looking back, that I didn't invest in my mental well-being, my emotional well-being, because I simply didn't think that I needed to. So the point at which I became aware that that was the wrong attitude to have. I had a crisis, had a kind of crashing down crisis while I was still in the RAF, while I was serving as a flight commander on 31 Squadron. And at that point, I was forced to kind of look back at how I got to that point, how I got to this point of crisis, as I describe it. And it became apparent through various therapies. I got some help from the RAF, I got some help from the NHS, and I went and got some support outside of prescribed or NHS prescribed treatments, if you like. But through that process, I became aware that I had been suffering from the symptoms of a depressive illness for some years up to that point, as I say, when I had a crisis in 2015. And essentially what I came to understand was that I had become, as I said, a victim of, or become susceptible to these cumulative symptoms. And it really was a build-up. It was a cumulative set of conditions, and my failure to adjust to those. And so I can list life events such as becoming a father. I mentioned my tour in Afghanistan. I spent 7 months away from my wife at the time while she was pregnant with my eldest daughter. So came home into a wife who was 8 months pregnant. A wife who was 7 months pregnant at the time, and ready to have our daughter, and hadn't been alongside her for that process. there's a whole bunch of other, contributing factors that it became clear to me that they were only contributing factors because I hadn't really acknowledged them. And so I talk now to others and jumping right forward to, what I would do if I was talking to others now about how I would do it differently and how potentially others might do things differently. I, as I said already, didn't take time to acknowledge that I needed to invest in my mental health. And that should have really started with some questions to myself about how I felt about the fact that the world around me was changing, becoming a dad, pressure on to work extra hours to get promoted, being away from home, spending lots of time separated from family and my support network and my loved ones. And if I'd really taken some time to look at the fact that things were always changing, things sometimes were difficult, and if I'd taken some time to ask myself, how was that affecting me? How did I feel sometimes just on a daily basis? How do I feel today? Because that's what I do now, and that's what I learned as kind of a mechanism I have to recognize when things are changing. Because when I look back 10 years, wasn't asking those questions. When I look back 8, 9 years from today, and when I had my crisis, it comes down to those cumulative failures by me to recognize that I was struggling, that I was failing to adjust to the changes that were happening around me, all the things I've already mentioned. And so at that point, I became way more aware. And that, I would say at that point, at the point of going through recovery, on my journey through recovery, having had a crisis, I realized that I could have helped myself. And I've been kind of equipped with some tools to help me move forward. I'm in a good place now, and a good place now, but everybody has high days, low days, good days, bad days. And as part of that whole thing that I've just talked about, which is recognizing that, being self-aware, having the awareness to reflect, to ask myself that question.
Yeah.
How do you feel? How do you feel today? How do you feel about the tough day you've had? How do you feel about something that's coming in the future that you might have a bit of trepidation around? And by asking that question of myself, and more specifically, not being afraid of the answer, I can then take that awareness and do something with it. Because when I look back at my build up to crisis, by not asking myself that question, by not being self-aware, I was unable then to take any steps to manage or to mitigate what might be coming. And so today, as I sit here now, I know that by having that awareness, I can then, reach out, tell somebody close to me. I'm very fortunate that I've got an amazing wife, close network of some friends and some colleagues. And I can quite readily say to them, hey, actually this is concerning me on this day, or I feel down about this, or I feel apprehensive about this. And I'm not doing that. And this is again part of what I offer as advice to others. I'm not doing that because I think that individual is going to be able to say, hey, I can solve that problem for you. By just having the awareness, by just raising it, by just sharing it, it can really, really play dividends. And in that context, again, when I look back at what I did differently before to how I manage life now, on a flying squadron, in amongst a bunch of like-minded individuals, I had a ready-made network there to do what I'm talking about. I do today. Talk to those closest to me, to talk to those around me about the pressures, the stresses, the strains, but I didn't. And that probably wasn't conscious for a number of reasons. I've explored this, and for a number of reasons it might have been subconscious. But I know that in those periods of time, years ago, I used to count compartmentalization as a strength. I thought, I was being strong by being able to box up what was going on in one given context. In this example, let's say work. I thought I was being strong by boxing up the stresses, the pressures, the strains of work life. Those bits I mentioned before, staying late to do the extra work
Hmm.
to prove myself worthy of promotion, putting in the extra hours because on occasions I felt like I wasn't as up to speed on a particular skill set or a knowledge set that I should have to be credible in the squadron. So putting in those extra hours or be, being under stress because I felt like I was under scrutiny. It happens on a flying squadron every day. You know, you're expected to perform. You're assessed, and you know, we used to talk on the squadron about the fact that, you know, essentially every trip was a form of assessment. You had to make the grade, and
Hmm.
especially, you know, coming from a background I did where I had been chopped on the conversion unit in the front seat. You know, I had this view of, as I look back now, I don't think I carried it with me in my flying career, but I had this view that, you know, at any point, you know, it could all end because
Yeah.
you were deemed not to being up to scratch. So all of those pressures and strains at work, I used to think, I'm doing a good job by not taking that stuff home with me.
Hmm.
And in the flip side, I used to look at the stresses and strains and the pressures of my home life
Yeah.
and think, well, I'm going to do a great job by not letting that bleed across into taking it to work. And so
Yeah.
I'd box that stuff up. Um, the danger with all of that, and again, when I talk to others now about how I would do it differently and how I would offer them some advice to not fall into the pitfalls that I did, was the danger is you put those things in a box, and you compartmentalize, then there's a danger that you never deal with them. That, and in my case, those things built and accumulated, and up to a point where, through having looked back and having known that I've looked at some of my symptoms and been being diagnosed as having depressive episodes and depressive illness up to the point of my crisis. The point was that they built up and they built up, and had I allowed some of that stuff to carry across boundaries or to come out of the box that I've compartmentalized it and put it
Hmm.
into, then there's every possibility, there's every probability that I would not have got to that point of a cumulative crisis. So when I look back on that now, the advice, when you think you're being strong, when you think you're doing what's right by keeping the boundaries, by closing things away, by keeping it to yourself because you think that you don't need to trouble somebody who's nearest, somebody who's close to you with those
Yeah.
with those issues. They don't need to hear it. Clearly, there's lots of stigmas, and some of those never more so than on a flying squadron, where it can be a pretty alpha
Oh
dominated
yeah.
environment. People are, I would suggest, certainly in my time, people were probably less inclined to show vulnerabilities. It was pretty competitive, certainly male dominated. And so there's a lot of maybe stigmas, a lot of cliches that perpetuated in that environment that probably didn't help me. As I say, I don't think I consciously succumbed to those sorts of ideas, but undoubtedly, subconsciously, I fitted into the cultures, let's muscle through this. And when I think back now to quotes that I hear of people trying to define what they think it means to be strong, to be mentally strong,
Mm.
then it's very often about muscling through, getting through that point of adversity, and proving that you can do it, on your own, or without support, or that you can get through this by being strong. And my offer now to others when I talk to them is that, be strong by having that self-awareness, be strong by having the ability to sit down and to reflect
Yeah.
and to ask yourself that,
Absolutely.
how do you feel, how does it, how are the conditions of your environment affecting your well-being, and once you get that self-awareness, once you have that
Yeah.
self-awareness, then you can use it to share with others. because certainly in my case, what existed in terms of the environment of flying squadron, and I have to say at home, I was not inclined to go home and to open up and share about the pressures at work. Again, not consciously because I thought I wasn't going to get the support, but in my mind, I didn't want to trouble
Yeah.
my family environment. I didn't want to bring them down. We had our own things to work through. We had our own challenges, whether it be around parenting, whether it be around moving, moving
All the
whatever,
normal stuff.
all the normal stuff. Exactly. I thought, right, well, I can be strong. I can box this up. What's happening
Yeah.
at work, and I won't share it. Of course, I realise now that for all the reasons I've just described, that was dangerous. And the position I'm in today, having learnt what I learnt, I can sit here comfortably and say that I am far better prepared to understand the pressures, to understand the impacts, to move from one day to the next through those challenges, because I feel that I can share it with those closest to me, whether that be family on the end of the phone, whether that be just coming home and telling my wife about the kind of day I've had at work, or something that's coming up that's maybe concentrating my mind, and it makes life much more easy to manage by breaking those things that I talked about, putting in a box, breaking them out of the box, allowing the boundaries to cross between where I thought previously I was being strong by compartmentalizing.
Yeah, so a few things to unpack here, Fats. I mean, thank you for sharing that. It's brilliant. So I like the way you say you kind of almost military precision towards mental health, which is great because I'm a logical person. If you see a problem, then you can deal with it. But some people, they're just like, me included, like I can't even get out of bed sometimes. Literally, I'm like, and like turning over is like the hardest thing in the world. So how would you advise people on that? Like, I think that someone said, I think it was a Navy guy said the best thing is just making your bed in the morning. Yeah, that's the first step.
Yeah.
But what advice would you give to people? Like I've been in them situations where it's just, you're like, what's the point? I can't be bothered, like I can't even get out of bed.
So pick up on one of the first things you said when you sort of posed that question, the logic flow and the precision. I take myself back to when I had my crisis, and I was initially referred for cognitive behavioural therapy through the RAF. I got some really good support internal to the RAF and the Department for Community Mental Health within the service. But I remember walking into my very first session expecting to be told how many sessions it was going to be, how long it was going to take, what the milestones were going to be in terms of my recovery, and at what point, I was going to be better.
Yeah,
And
I always say, like I said to my, just to interrupt you, I was like, I just want the answer. Tell me the answer.
yeah,
But there's
yeah.
no answer as such, is it? It's not 2 + 2 = 4. There's nothing like that.
So I was grateful at the time because the practitioner who I saw at the time, she saw this in me very, very quickly,
All
and she,
right, okay.
and she said, right, you've got to re-baseline your understanding in terms of what we're going to get from this. This could be 4 sessions, this could be 44 sessions, this could be 4 weeks, this could be 4 years, kind of thing. And so I did have to reset my approach, which was very much. It's not just military. I think it's. I may be talking entirely out of turn here, but I see that as a very male-based approach. Probably because of the environment I come from. Again, on a flying squadron, here's a problem set. Go find your resources, your skills, the right people.
Yeah.
Set yourself a timeline. What are the objectives? And go achieve it, right? And that's how I approached my treatments when I first was prescribed some treatment. So I've had to learn that it's certainly not that way. And I went through a series of different therapies, all exposing different kind of bits of my what I call now is my tool set
Hmm.
for how I move forward and how I get forward on a day to day basis. If I take myself back to the kind of depths of my my low point, actually coming out of crisis, or once the crisis had hit and I realized that I was in a bad place, that was actually my toughest time. And I had mornings like you describe where I felt like I didn't want to face the
Hmm.
world. That my problem set was um, beyond my ability to solve. That I couldn't see my way through it, um, and and I can absolutely relate with what you're saying now. What advice would I give those who are going through that, off the back of your question, in terms of um, how do you get over that? And you touched on the if you're going to start, you've got to make your bed, right?
Hmm.
There is there is a book that I've read, nothing to do with mental health, but it's to do with just being successful and getting through challenges as you see them. And it's called something like the one thing. And I'm not necessarily pointing your listeners and your watchers to this book, but there is a statement in there about what is the one thing I can do now to
Hmm.
get to where I want to in the future. And that future could be to the bathroom to brush your teeth. That
Hmm.
future could be your 10-year plan for building financial freedom, or your 10-year plan for something else. If you ask yourself, what is the one thing I can do? This is the critical word, I'd say, can, because it's not what I should do. It's not what I will do. It's not about anybody else's perceptions of what they think you should do. It's
Yeah.
about you on that at that moment. What is the one thing I can do? And if you break it down into small chunks, if you're lying, kind of I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the question that you asked, which is, if you're in bed thinking, well, I don't want to face the day because the day's filled with events one, two, three, four, and five, and in between times I've got to do events X, Y, and Z. If you
Hmm.
see that in its totality of the day before you even think about the week, the
Yeah.
month, the year,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, too big, right? So break it down into the smaller chunks, and then having broken it down, what's the one thing I can do? And it might be, well, I know that I need to take that call at 9 o'clock.
Hmm.
My first chunk, if you like. What's the one thing I can do to step towards that? I'll tell you what, it's to go and have a shower. Okay, it's in my sphere. It's well within my sphere of
Yeah.
influence. It's well within my capabilities, and I'm not going to think about anything more beyond that. I'm going to get in the shower,
Yeah.
and then and then once I'm there, it's right. Well, I'll brush the teeth, have breakfast, yeah, and move on from there. Because I know from my own experience, it wasn't the lying in bed in the morning. It was actually going to bed at night where I had real problems, because it came down to this enormity of the situation I found myself in. The fact that
Hmm.
I couldn't see myself getting through the week. I couldn't see myself getting through the month. I couldn't see myself in 2 or 3 years' time. Um, and I'd lost myself in some pretty dark places, some fairly well formulated and well planned out suicidal intentions,
Hmm.
based on the fact that I thought, well, I can't see myself in a week, I can't see myself in a month, I don't want to go through what I see as this problem set. Now, if I go back to where my advice is coming from and how I would have done that differently, it's like, well, I can get through tonight, I can get through tomorrow, by breaking it down into those individual chunks. That's probably a pretty crude way of putting it, but you know, yes, if you're going to change the world, you've got to start by making your bed, right?
Yeah.
But don't think of it as, I would say, I would offer it as, don't think of it in its in its entirety of where do I think I need to get to, either at the end of the day, the end of the year, the end of the 10-year plan. It's like, what is the one thing I can do now? And I'm going to do it. That might be, I'm going to turn on the light.
Yeah.
I'm going to open the curtains. I'm going to feed the cat. I'm going to, what is the one thing I can do now that gets me moving in the direction for the outcome? And the bit that I nuance there is the outcome. Don't make it too big.
So when you were on a flying squadron, did you feel like there was much support and help for you there?
It's really interesting because in all of what I talk about now, in terms of how I would do, how I'd offer support and how I would do things differently to what I did before, I always talk about the opening up and sharing with those closest to you. And I refer to friends, I refer to family, I refer to colleagues. And when I think about my time in the service, I will always refer to what a great environment it was to be in a close knit community of people who were like minded, there for the same purpose, that we'd all been through some really tough times together, and we'd been through some good times together. We knew the best of each other. We knew how to get the most out of each other. And that sort of environment is actually perfect in terms of offering the kind of support I'm suggesting you might get from those closest to you. So there is a real sense of irony when I look back that when I was going through difficulties, that firstly I didn't recognize those in myself, but I didn't take advantage of that network that was there for me on my doorstep. Because I know now when I look back, and I had that kind of crashing crisis that I talked about, it was apparent to everybody around me that there was a problem. I was on a flying squadron for a period of nearly 6 months. I couldn't fly while I was being given treatment,
Oh,
and
right.
getting back on my feet. So that really hit me hard. But that was the opportunity to go to those on the squadron and say, hey, listen, this is the reason. These are the problems I'm facing. But if I'd done that earlier, I probably wouldn't have had that crashing crisis. And so when I'm talking to others about what how you can find support, a flying squadron, a close knit environment like that, where people do know each other well, where people can see the differences in you. One of the things I talk about with my mental well being is that the changes in me and others you can be relatively easy to spot if you've got the
Yeah.
awareness that things are changing. And in a flying squadron environment where you live in each other's pockets day to day, long periods of deployment, week to week, month to month, away from home, as I say, going through bad times, good times, learning what makes each other tick. That's a really good In my view, that's a really good environment for those changes to be identified or to be spotted. So I think if I was to walk into the crew room and say, hey, can we have a chat? I think I'm struggling for this reason or for that reason. It's more likely that you'll get a really supportive reaction from somebody who knows you well. And in that sort of environment says, well, actually, you're right. I've known you for 2 years. We've worked closely together, and yet I've seen a change in you recently. Well, that makes sense because I've got this issue, or I've got this, this problem that I'm facing. And I think that today, the context that we're in, the contemporary context that we're in today, where the awareness around well-being, mental health, all of the interdependencies between mental health and your physical well-being, your ability to do your job, your ability to all the knock-on effects for your ability to go about your daily life. I think that is pretty well understood now. And so I think a flying squadron it should be a really safe place to go and have that sorts of conversations. I've been a few years away from it now. I do keep a finger on the pulse in terms of activities on and around fast jet flying squadrons. And I do feel that, for those that are considering what it might be like in that environment, I think it's probably a really good and a really healthy place to have those sorts of conversations. Fortunately, unfortunately for me, all those years back, I was probably subconsciously staying away from sharing my problems for all the reasons we've already
Hmm.
discussed. And so I didn't take advantage of what should have been a good environment to be in at the time.
And one thing we haven't mentioned as well, humor is a massive part of it. If you like just a bit of humor,
Yeah.
and then you're like, oh, he's the mental case, like, and then you just like kind of have a little chuckle, and it totally helps.
It does. I think there's probably a fairly unique brand of humor when it comes to that sort of stuff on a flying squadron,
Yeah, I can
and
imagine.
at the same time, there's probably a fairly fine balance to be called. I didn't, not that I was aware, but I didn't become, mental Phats or, crazy Phats or any of that sort of stuff. But yeah,
Yeah,
I'm absolutely convinced there will be other examples of that, because, as you rightly point out, a key coping mechanism, providing you know why you're using it as a coping mechanism, can be the humour that you would find in a military environment, certainly on a flying squadron.
So, can you feel when you're going to have a bad day or a bad moment? Because I certainly can, and what I call it is my Sunday head. So, do you remember like when you were a kid and it was Sunday, but you knew you were going to school tomorrow, but you were still off, but you were still aware, and then Monday comes, and you're like, oh. So I call it my Sunday head. Do you have
Yeah,
something similar to that?
I absolutely recognise that, and I think I wouldn't label it as a Sunday head, because again, I've given myself some tools to
Yeah.
try to get away from, um, labeling or putting, states in the sand that might otherwise point me towards, well, it's Sunday, I should have a bad day.
Hmm.
We in flying training, we used to talk about the fear would return
Oh.
on a Sunday evening. You'd go and let your hair down on a Friday night, happy hour in the bar. You'd have a big Friday, big Saturday, probably out somewhere blowing off steam. Clearly, and booze and hangovers do not. I know that now, they definitely don't help with management of
Yeah.
good mental health. I still enjoy a few beers, but I absolutely understand the difficulties there. But we used to talk on a Sunday. You get to the end of Sunday, and you're staring down the fear of going back into that environment where you're under pressure. Every trip's an
Hmm.
assessment, and it was the Sunday night fear. So I recognise that. But going back to the very start of your question, I also, yes, absolutely, I can see when I'm having or leaning towards what might be a low point.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's tiredness, undue tiredness. Sometimes it's just recognizing, it's this self awareness is so key.
Yeah.
Recognizing that I'm irritable about something that doesn't deserve me to be irritable about. It's maybe an irrational thought, and I can absolutely see that happening. And I know that 10 years ago, as I say, building up to my crisis, I could not see that in myself. And
Hmm.
so these tools and these self awareness, the ability to recognize that really, really, really helps me, because it might just be, um, uh, by recognizing it, I can internalize my correction of
Hmm.
that vector that I'm on. Feel a bit down, or feel a bit irrational, or feel a bit, as I said, irritable. And just by thinking, well, that's not justified in this instance,
Yeah.
I can correct that thought without having to go and find something physical to, people have lots of different tools, things you go and touch, things you go and do, something that you go and tell somebody, which I sometimes I will do. I'll say to my wife, I recognize I'm having a tough afternoon.
Hmm.
But by vocalizing it, it can be enough to turn around. So I absolutely see that, Sunday night fear, Sunday night head that you've mentioned. My advice on that very specific front would be try to try to get away from labeling a distinct point that you can then all too readily attach that low mood or that feeling to, be it Sunday, be it Monday morning. They talk about, don't they talk about the second Monday in January, I think, being like Blue Monday. That's like
Yeah.
the
The most
lowest
depressive day or
mood.
something. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And do you know what? If that stuff is labeled as such, or if in your mind that's an easy day to go and say, well, if anybody's allowed to have a low mood day, then this is the day.
Yeah.
You're probably going to go in that direction. So, advice for anybody who is facing that kind of challenge: try to break away from tagging those feelings onto something particular, because it gives you an easy out. It gives you an easy reason to go down that line. And then just by recognizing it, if you do find yourself there, just by recognizing it might be enough to say, hey, listen, I see what's happening here. I can do something about that, whether it be something physical, whether it be something internalized, that you just change your cognitive feelings towards that. Those are the kind of tools that I've been given as part of my recovery anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. But on the flip side as well, because I think it's okay if you're bad one day. It's okay. You don't have to get up and face the world if you don't want to. I've had many days, maybe you'll disagree, but I've had many days where I've had I've got editing to do because this is my full-time job, luckily, and I'm like, I just can't do it. And then my girlfriend will say, okay, just take a day, it's fine. I'm like, and then the next day I might be absolutely fine. So I
Yeah.
think for me, sometimes it is okay to take a day and say, yeah, I feel shit. I'm going to take a day off. I don't have to get up and do anything. So, I mean, each to their own. Everyone's different, as you say, but I don't know what your take on that is.
I would agree with that. I mean, there is a kind of a campaign around a slogan, which is "It's okay not to be okay," and
Yeah,
and I read that and I can align and recognize with that, in terms of it's okay to share with somebody else that you're not okay. Um, I do take your point, which is sometimes it's all right to have those down days. The key to that, as I've said a number of times, is the awareness of that.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, and I'm not saying, my point about what's the one thing you can do. It might be that the one thing you can do today is get up and have a shower,
yeah,
and that's as far as it goes. Not that you have to accept that you have to get up in your case and do your editing. It's like, yeah, absolutely. If today isn't the day, what is the one thing I can do? I can get up, I can have a shower, I can feed the dog, I can have a walk, and then I'll reassess.
yeah,
Not about
absolutely.
how do I get out of bed now, because by the end of today I have to have achieved editing, 4 podcasts or whatever. So yes, it's okay not to be okay. There's a few ways. My advice is a few ways you can read that. It's okay to share that you're not okay, but it's also really, really important to recognize that you're not okay, and then it's down to you to decide what you're going to do about that. Change your thinking, do something. What the one thing that you can do, or maybe nothing, and accept that tomorrow is going to be different.
But before we wrap up, is there any advice for people going into the RAF or the forces in general who think, oh, they're not going to take me because of I've got this mental illness or whatever? Is there any advice there? Is there still a stigma with the forces, particularly the RAF?
It's a really good question, and we could probably talk for another half an hour on it. And it would be based on my own perceptions. I think um, the stigmas that I would see in the RAF are probably reflective of what you get um, in the wider world. There
Okay.
is definitely way more acceptance, my view, more acceptance than there might have been 20, 15 years ago, of those who feel like they want to come forward and to talk about the challenges that they're facing around their mental health. I think this, what you're doing here, your initiative to put together a mini series to link it to the topic of aviation is really commendable. and reflects, I think, the fact that in the aviation world there is more acceptance of this type of challenge that we are all likely to face.
Yeah.
I go back to some of my story. I think where the problems came, it was all self-induced. It was all the fact that I thought what was being expected of me was to show that I could be strong to get through my problem set. I think in my time scale, 10 years, if I'd sat down and said, hey, listen, I think I've got an issue, or I can't see a way through this, or for whatever reason I've identified that I may have some challenges around my mental health, I think it would have been well received. I would have been pointed in the right place. I think you carry that forward now, 10 years from where I'm talking about having my own issues. I think it's much better understood now, and there's more awareness of the support networks, the support outlets, whether that be internal to the service, whether that be external to the service, and anybody who thinks that having a mental health problem is going to preclude them getting into the Air Force. I'd say you've got to treat it like any physical health issue. Mm-hmm. Raise it as part of the process of exploring your entry into the service. Talk about it openly. Be open to being suggested routes of support. The most dangerous thing that anybody can do, I think my message has been loud and clear through the 30 minutes we've had, is the most dangerous thing you can do is keep it to yourself.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the whole point of this series, and I appreciate you coming on, Phats. But can we find you online anywhere? And are you on the lecture circuit to talk about mental health yourself?
No, I'm not. I mean, I do talk about it with people who listen. I've done some content on social media. You'll find me on Instagram, and for those who've seen your own Instagram, I know that I'm tagged through that at Phats Taylor. That's Phats with a PH. And through my Instagram, I certainly do some publicity around mental health events, mental health charities. I've put on some very short snippets that capture some of the themes of the bits that we've talked about today. But no, I'm here to talk. I'm here to listen. For anybody that does catch me via social media or in person, certainly in and around the aviation world, then please feel free to stop me, ask the questions, build on some of the topics that we've covered today. I'm very happy to share.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the good things about social media. I think you're probably aware, I'm not going to mention names, but maybe there were last month people were having mental health issues and everyone's inbox me, I'm here to talk. And I think that's a great thing, because people think that sometimes they're not worth it, but it's I've even said, it's let's have a chat if you want. I might not even know the person, but someone to chat to, and I think that's great. So if you do get any inboxes, I think that's great. So but Phats, thank you very much for coming on the show. I'm sure we'll have you on another time to talk about your time on the Tornado, because it sounds like you've had an incredible career. But thanks very much for sharing your story, mate.
You're very welcome. I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Cheers.